This is Dateline News and Conversation. Got another very interesting show for you tonight. My guest, he's returning, Russian-born, American citizen, and returned to Russia. He's an expert on military, warfare, and many other things. Stas Kraprivnik, welcome back to the show.
Always a pleasure.
Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure to have you. I really enjoy having you on a show because, unlike so many other people that I interview from the United States, from the West, they're not living in Russia. And they're all prognosticating about what's happening in Russia, what's happening in the special military operation without being here. You know, they're scouring and browsing the internet, looking for sources that they think are credible, but they're not here. And so I'm always very happy to have you back. Now, Stas, we've talked about the special military operation many times, how it's going, what the next step is, etc. I want to ask you right off the bat, do you think this is a stalemate as the Western media is presenting? That's just the first simple, easy question.
No, it's not a stalemate. The Russian military is advancing. It was advancing during the counteroffensive, anyways, to begin with. So the 120 square kilometers that Ukraine threw 80,000 lives away on around Rabitina, which is being eaten up and split up steadily right now in an actual counteroffensive. And Ukraine, even at that time, around Svatova, lost Svatova Kramatorsk lost around about 300 square kilometers. Up and down the line of contact, or the front, the Russian military is moving forward. The only place that it's not quite moving forward, well, it is, but it's not, is the on the other side, the landing areas that the Ukrainians carved out for themselves on the other side of the Dnieper River from Kherson. And honestly, even the fighting that we are doing there on the edges, I don't understand why even bother. Mine it in, block it in, and they're being artillery shelled as it is. It's just it's basically a meat locker. Any of these landing areas, most of those guys don't live with for a week in those areas, but they've become political goals. And Zelensky continues throwing in the Marines and whatever else he can get across the Dnieper River, and these guys are just getting turned into fresh hamburger on a daily basis. Now, a couple of those landing areas and villages that they're holding right on the riverside are being cleared out by the Russian army. I don't see why. Honestly, as much as I prefer the offensive in those areas, let them keep coming over and just keep turning them into hamburger. I mean, it's you mine out the area. They can't really leave those areas anyways because they're surrounded by swampland and there's very narrow passages. They can't bring any armored vehicles across. So just let them keep coming and just keep turning them into hamburger. That's on the Kherson front. Everywhere else, the Russian army is moving forward slowly. The conservation of forces slowly. There's still about 350,000 plus in reserve, and that's not counting everybody else that's still sitting on the rest of the Russian / NATO borders. So no, it's not a stalemate. It's not a huge offensive, but it's not a stalemate. We're moving forward everywhere, a little here, a little there. But in the process, Ukraine's reserves are being just mauled. So how long before they start really collapsing? Anybody's guess. I mean, Zelensky says going into full mobilization mode, which in this case will be 500,000 people thrown in just to buy him more time to breathe. Because quite literally, if he can't advance and he can't fight, he's going to get killed, probably by the U.S. itself and its agents, if not by somebody near him. So he's quite happy to continue sacrificing.
Okay, let me ask you this. I've been reading lately that Russia has surrounded or taken over a city south of Donetsk that has been heavily fortified and from which they've been shelling the people in Donetsk. And they've killed, who knows, maybe 15, 20,000 people, men, women, and children, destroyed much of the infrastructure. What can you tell me about what is happening there? And has this caused a cessation of the shelling of the city of Donetsk?
Well, first of all, it's not even a town; it's a suburb called Marinka. It's part of the agglomeration of Donetsk, and it's been in the hands of the Ukis from day one. They've heavily fortified this area. There's about 3,000 buildings, so about 2/3 of those buildings are individual homes, and then the rest are multi-story buildings. That area has been heavily fortified. They've been pouring cement there for the last 8 years, making bunkers, passageways, elevators to lift small artillery pieces up to shoot, and then lower them back down, and so on. What it allowed them to do with relatively light artillery is to continue harassment fire on the civilians in southwestern Donetsk. Donetsk city itself is about 1 million people, or was at its height. Agglomeration is probably about 1.5 million surrounding area, and this was part of a conglomeration. They've been cleared out. Behind them are two more towns. Just the road. The road just, it's a sign. This town ended, next town started, like that. So there's not like any kind of gaps. This is just one big residential conglomeration. And then the Russian army is continuing on to the next town. So it hasn't stopped, and it won't stop the terror bombing of Donetsk. It does remove quite a few of the short-range pieces, pushing them back, so they can't hit those areas anymore. Those areas of Donetsk that they were hitting in southwestern Donetsk. So it will lower, and already has lowered the volume of fire. Now, the UN officially states that 8,000 Ukrainian civilians have died in this war, which is very disingenuous, because what they're counting as Ukrainians, civilians, is anybody living in Ukraine. But when you break it down into actual who's killing whom, there's about, out of those official 8,000 civilians killed, 6,000 of them are Russians. The other 2,000 are Ukrainians. And usually because Zelinsky and type are storing large volumes of explosives or ordnance in areas where civilians are housed, using them as human shields. So the vast majority of those killed, the vast majority of civilians killed, are killed by America's proxies and by America, because HIMARS, those are Americans manning those HIMARS systems. It's America from start to end with an ATACMS missile coming out of a HIMARS. Americans manufacture them, Americans deliver them, Americans load them into the HIMARS platform. Americans are controlling those HIMARS as contractors. Americans are launching those ATACMS, and those ATACMS are being guided in by American satellites. It's America waging direct war with Russia, as direct as you can, without actually dropping in divisions directly in. So yes, we are at war. I mean, I don't know how else to put it.
I'm glad you said that. I've been saying it for a long time, that this is a direct war between the United States and Russia. You can say it's a proxy war using Ukraine. I prefer to say that it is a direct war between Russia, the United States, and Russia on the soccer field, the playing field of Ukraine. So I'm glad you emphasized that. Now, what do you think is next for Russia? Now, everybody speculates about this. Oh, Russia's just going to sit back. defend what it has already, get through the winter, and we'll see what happens in the spring. What do you think the strategy is?
Well, to begin with, there's no defend what Russia has because the problem with the West is it absolutely ignores the Russian constitution. It doesn't exist. Or Russian desires, wills, it projects its own needs onto what Russia is going to do. So for the viewers, let me explain. Those territories, Donetsk, Lugansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, Khersonov, are all now Russian provinces. All of them, including the 1/3 of them that's occupied by Ukraine. There is no trading. There's no card trading in this case. The Russian Constitution does not allow anybody to give up any square centimeter of land. Those borders are what those borders are. So there's not going to be any trading. There's not going to be any Putin give up those areas or whatever. No, it's not going to happen. So the Russian army is going to continue expanding. Now, since Ukraine is going to continue using up the Russian population in central Ukraine, which is the oblast of Poltava, the oblast of Kharkov, the oblast of Odessa, the oblast of Nikolaev, those oblasts are also going to get freed. It's a matter of, the question is how much of the Ukrainian army is going to be able to hold before they break and before they have to move an evacuation to the Dnieper River, to the other bank of the Dnieper River, the West Bank, to try to make a new line. Dnepropetrovsk also as one of the oblasts, Russian oblasts, ethnically Russian oblasts. So no, there's not going to be any sitting back. You can't win this war by sitting back. The West needs Russia to sit back. The West needs Russia to come and sign another Minsk, so they can build up Ukraine and drop more mercs in and then start the war again in a year, 2 years, when they can build up enough reserves and artillery and everything else. And the West is dumb enough to think that Russia's going to fall for it again. 12 years, in 2014, 2015, when Minsk was being negotiated, I was telling everybody who would listen, and people in government too, that this is pointless. You cannot trust the West, because they look at us as dumb animals, or something a little higher than a dumb animal. And there's, the U.S. signed 200 plus treaties with the Indians. Half of them they broke before the ink dried. Not a single treaty did the U.S. Respect. England signed God only knows how many treaties and broke every one of them. It's a Western approach. They look, hell, they don't like each other, let alone anybody outside of the West. So there's nobody you can trust. And now that Hollanday and Merkel did a great service to Russia, when they both came out to the media and laughed about how they set Putin up, and Minsk was only about buying time to build up the Ukrainian army to attack, not just, and they flat out said, not just to attack the rebel territories, but to wage war with Russia, into Russia. So no, there is absolutely no one there. Who is Russia going to negotiate with? There's no one that Russia trusts. There's no one in the West except that Orban, and he's being bypassed. Orban and Robert. Robert is the president of Slovakia. And those two are being bypassed by
Robert Fico.
Huh? Yeah.
Robert Fico.
Right. And those two are being bypassed by the West. So there's absolutely no one that you can trust in the West. If their lips are moving and their heart is beating, they're lying. So unless there's major changes in government in Western countries, there's absolutely no. Russia will dictate terms to a defeated West. That's the only way this is going to end, without massive changes of government in the West, because there's nobody you can doctor. They're all lying pigs. I don't know how else to put it.
Yeah. And Stas, I keep going back to what Putin articulated before the special military, immediately before it. Many times since, Lavrov has repeated it, so has Peskov. There are 3 major goals, objectives of this special military operation. As Putin has said, they're not negotiable. Number 1, demilitarize Ukraine, so it's never a threat to Russia. Denazify Ukraine, Whoa, that's more of a political challenge, I think, because it's a matter of re educating maybe millions of people, at least in Western Ukraine. And number three, to guarantee a constitutionally neutral Ukraine. That means changing the government. I don't know how you can make it any more simple than that. And yet, what we're starting to hear now is a changing narrative about, oh, what peace negotiations, peace talks. I think, as you just said, and I'd like you to respond to what I just offered, these three goals are not negotiable. And what does that really mean, Stas?
Well, the only way you're gonna denazify Western Ukraine is when it becomes part of it becomes part of Hungary, part of it becomes part of Slovakia, part of it becomes part of Romania, and a big chunk becomes part of Poland. Of course, the Poles are Nazis themselves, and they always have been. They don't like to admit it. They were Hitler's first allies. They were the advocates for the Nazi Germans in the League of Nations because they weren't. Hitler wasn't in the League of Nations, and they stood for the interests of the Germans. When Poltowski died, the dictator of Poland, at his funeral, the place of honor to the right of the casket is where, if you look at the archival pictures, you see Hitler, Goering, Goebbels, and the whole bunch. The problem with the Poles was they got greedy. And when they got a piece of Czechoslovakia, the British and the French offered a whole lot of promises of what they were going to give them if they just turned on the Germans, and they did. There was a Polish journalist, Arthur. I'm sorry. He's a Polish journalist that came out with a column in the Polish paper the other day that said, oh, well, look at the documents. We should have stuck with the Germans. We would have been taken in parades in Moscow. Well, and that was actually Hitler's plan for the Poles as a co-belligerent against the Soviet Union, as an ally. This is why he revenged himself so heavily on the Poles, because the Poles backstabbed him. Of course, the Poles exterminated their Jews in 1939. They exterminated their Germans between 1945 and 1948, including from Silesia and new territories. So, and they're going to do the same to the Ukrainian men once those territories become part of Poland. They don't need the men. The women they need, because they can make new Poles out of them, with them. And out of the kids, you can make new Poles. But the men you don't need. So that's what's going to happen. And that, by the way, I think the goal for the U.S., it's not peace. Obviously, the elections are coming up, so Biden needs something. But the U.S. needs this war to continue. And the best way to get this war expanded with the Ukrainian army being basically used up. And they're the average age of the Ukrainian frontline soldiers around 45. Let that sink in. It's around 45. Because when you do an average of 60 and 16, you're going to get around 45. Not because they're actually all 45-year-olds or 43-year-olds. Now, the best way to get that going is the next phase of the war is once the Ukrainian government collapses and the Poles march in, is to get the Poles and the Russians fighting. And when you got integrated CIA, MI6 in there, to start an incident and get the war widened isn't going to be that difficult in the chaos of things. So I think that's the next step in the U.S. plan on expanding this war. And expand they want.
Yeah, I agree with you, obviously. But let's look at the reality on the ground in Ukraine. For one, the narrative in the West is changing. They've all but said everything has failed. The counteroffensive failed. People in the mainstream media who have talked with undisclosed, unnamed aides to Zelinsky in Ukraine have called him messianic, delusional, won't accept the reality on the ground. Others have said we've lost. So the narrative coming from the Western media is changing. the narrative about Zelinsky has also been humming along for the last several months. In the beginning, they were saying, well, is America looking for an off ramp? Are they looking for a way to throw Zelinsky under the bus? You mentioned in the outset, Zelinsky may end up losing his life. What are your thoughts on the changing narrative vis a vis the situation on the ground and Zelensky's fate?
Well, I'm old-fashioned and traditional, so my preferred would be uh, Zelensky in chains in Moscow, full court hearings, and then a good beheading somewhere on Red Square for the audience, because that man has so much blood that he's responsible for, and his wife too. She's just as responsible for it as he is, and she's spending the money that they're stealing just as much. So I don't see any mercy on that. Let God sort him out. Our job is to present him, but he's never going to make it to Moscow. He'll be killed. He's not. The moment he's not in power, he's a liability, and the U.S. has a tendency of tying up all its loose strings real quick, one way or the other. The only hope Zelensky has for the next breath of air is to continue sacrificing, satanically continue sacrificing more and more Ukrainians, destroying the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, which, by the way, 2/3 of Ukrainians belong to, destroying any of the culture, destroying everything he can. He'll sacrifice anything to the devil not to meet the devil as long as possible. And the devil's handmaidens are his bosses out in Washington. So he's got a little problem there. So the moment anything starts talking toward peace, he's no longer needed. And he becomes a scapegoat. And somebody has to take responsibility. Biden sure as hell isn't going to. His drugged up little princeling son isn't going to. So somebody has to. Well, it'll be Zelensky. And if Zelensky makes it to the U.S. somehow alive, my feeling is within a year he'll have the Marcus treatment. If you remember Fidel Marcus, who was the U.S. Vassal in the Philippines, committed heinous acts, but upheld U.S. power in the Philippines. And when he's finally overthrown and he takes his millions stolen, the U.S. had no problem with him stealing. Comes to the U.S. suddenly gets all self-righteous and tries him and puts him in jail for corruption that the U.S. sponsored and itself sponsored, and of course steals all the money he stole. So I'm thinking Zelensky's got about the same future if he lives long enough for that.
Okay. What do you think is going to happen? Now, you were raised in the United States. You went to college there. You were in the United States military. You're very familiar with American culture, American politics. What impact is this going to have on the United States elections coming up here in 2024 in November? And I want to ask you this straight out. Do you think that Biden will even end up being the candidate to run whoever is the Republican nominee? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, honestly, and this goes to every single American out there that isn't zombie asleep, and anybody listening to your show is obviously awake. Let me just ask anybody, after everything that's happened over the last 2 years, particularly last year with Trump, straight up Trump, not because of Trump as a person, Trump, but Trump as the candidate, do you honestly believe your elections matter? I mean, seriously. They've taken the masks off. Whatever their election results are, there is no democracy. There's no republic in the U.S. There's an oligarchy that's willing to do anything. They've broken every single law they can to keep Trump from being a candidate. They're pushing Nikki Haley, who's basically, she's the Republican version of the, okay, there's one party in America. They're called the neocons. They now control both wings of the same bird. So she's the Republican version of the Biden, the collective Biden. She's vacant. There's nobody at home, and she does what she's told. Same thing as Biden. Um, there are no unique or new ideas in the heads of either one of them. That probably haven't ever been. They'll do as they're told. Whether Biden can remember what he did yesterday or 5 minutes ago is a different case. But either way, that's what you're being pushed to. I mean, all the masks are being taken off. They've taken the biggest, most popular candidate, and they're now stripping them off state by state from elections. And people still want to call that a republic? Rome called itself a republic long after it was no longer a republic. And this isn't even an empire anymore. This is a flat-out oligarchy, where the peasants are given this little ritual called elections. But the results, Mark Twain said 140 years ago, if elections could decide anything, they would have been made illegal. And he was right. Except it's the theater, the Kyoto theater is now so far gone. There's no even shadow puppets. I mean, it's flat out. The lights are on. Welcome to reality. You're owned, and your owners are going to do whatever the hell they want. And whether or not you push a button for Republican or Democrat, you're pushing a button for the exact same people. And you're going to get a war, whether you like it or not. You're going to get poverty, whether you like it or not. You're going to get your 15-minute city prison, whether you like it or not. You're going to get your health passport from the WHO, whether you like it or not. I mean, it's just how it is. Because continue believing in the system. I mean, my entire adult life, I've heard, oh, we'll fix it with the next elections. No, you won't. The system, it's not even broken. It's just rigged that it never worked to begin with. You're never going to fix it with the next election. If anything, it's only going to get worse with the election. I mean, just the simple fact, if you look at statistically, the Republican Party is anti-Democrat. And these idiots are ready to beat the crap out of each other because one guy's wearing a D and one guy's wearing an R. Welcome to reality. The Republican Party has never once canceled a single program that the Democratic Party passes. So the way the system works is the Democrats pass a bunch of programs that give them power, and the Republicans too. And the Republicans that come in and tweak them to make them look to work better in a rollback. And the peasants go, oh yeah, we're winning. Oh, we're getting a little power back. No, you're not. You're getting nothing back. You're owned. I mean, you're owned. And what people, by the way, are calling, oh, get physical gold because when it all crashes down, I got one thing to say. 1932. That's when a G-man stood in every single bank and everybody went in to get their gold coins. They got confiscated. And have the gold jewelry got confiscated. When the government confiscated that gold once, they'll do it again. It's much easier the second time. It's like sex. The first time's the second time, okay, we kind of know what we're doing. And they haven't forgotten anything. So the simple fact is the people that are in power now and the system in power now is self-perpetuating. It's not going to ever leave. It has to be booted if you wanted to leave. And elections don't work. They never have. At least not within the last 60, 70 years, that's for sure.
Yeah. I don't think there's a lot of people who are watching my show who would disagree with that. I certainly don't. Anyway, I want to keep this on United States and domestic politics. The left, whatever's left of it or whatever you want to call it, the peace groups, which are not united and haven't been probably since the Vietnam War, or maybe the first time the United States was going to go into Iraq, but they're all splintered today. And yet, there's an issue that I've been concerned about and a personality that I've been concerned about that these peace groups have adopted as their golden boy, their Wunderkind, who is now speaking telling things that they want to hear about the corrupt United States government and its foreign policy. That's one Jeffrey Sachs. As a Russian born and living in the United States, being educated there, Do you even remember the name Jeffrey Sachs? And what do you remember about him?
Well, before I go into that, one little correction. When you're saying the peace groups that are leftist, if you actually look, the real peace groups, the real pro-peace people, are today called paleo-conservatives, or at one point they were just called conservatives. Paleo, like they're ancient conservatives. But those are the people that actually say that the U.S. shouldn't interfere in other countries, trade with them, maybe set an example for them, but not interfere with them. And those people, the left has never really been pro-peace. It had a little short run in Vietnam, but other than that, it's never really been pro-peace. Because let's remember who Woodrow Wilson was. He was a progressive. And from day one, he was about interfering in other people's lives, wars, economies, and so on. And Woodrow Wilson is considered a great example by the left. So I would disagree that the left is pro-peace. There are pro-peace elements on the left, but they've always been small, except in the 1970s, late 60s, the anti-Vietnam War sentiment. But after that, it all disappeared. It got co-opted. And it was never that strong to begin with. The left has always enjoyed interfering in other countries. That's where the whole nation-building thing comes from. We're going to show you how to properly live. Well, yeah, to do that, you just got to kill everybody who doesn't want to be like you, or thinks they have other ideas on how to properly live. So the paleo-conservatives are the only ones that really out there that want peace, because they don't want interference. They don't want to be interfered with, and they don't want to interfere with other people. As far as Jeffrey Sachs, yeah, of course, shock therapy. Anybody that knows economics or anything from the 90s knows that name. Sachs was responsible for the theories of shock therapy. In Russia, that was implemented by a prime minister called Gaidar. Gaidar was, to put it mildly, a nincompoop. Well, he represented the oligarch class that was growing under Yeltsin. They were selling off, there were fire sales of all Russian industry. In fact, quite a few American companies, I had more than a few American suppliers who bought up all that non-existent Soviet technology and are running their plants still today on those machines. Basic concept with Gaidar was, we don't need industry. We have oil and gas. We'll buy whatever we need, which is great for the elite. That 500,000 people or so. And maybe you need another few million people to run agriculture and extraction industries. And the rest of the people could just go die off somewhere. And quite a few million people did die off from societal collapse, economic societal collapse. So yeah, I know Gaidar quite a bit. And Gaidar grew up with Sachs's advice. Now, I'll give Sachs this, that back in, I think it was Columbia University. Or institute back
Harvard.
Was it Harvard? But
yeah,
back
he was
in
at Harvard.
2016, 2015, 2016, he started warning people that this is going to end in war with Ukraine. And he was right. I mean, but anybody that looked at reality without any kind of glasses or shutters had to know that this is only going to end in war, because Russia was back on its feet, back bigger and faster every year, and Russia was not going to tolerate NATO that much closer, literally on its border. And already the civil war was going full swing in Ukraine, and Russian speakers were either being forced to assimilate into this. And by the way, Ukrainian culture is artificially created. Anybody that actually reads history, Ukrainian culture was created in the 1880s in Austro-Hungary, when they were forced converting the Carpathian Russians, the Carpathian Rus, to Catholicism and creating a new culture for them so they wouldn't rip away from the Austro-Hungarian Empire and join the Russian Empire. Those are Russians. So the whole thing was artificially created. And then the Ukrainian state was artificially created by Lenin. So they shouldn't be taking his statues down. They should be kissing his arse, since he created Ukraine. But it was obvious, how everything was going. So yeah, Sachs was one of the earlier birds singing that tune, but I wouldn't say it was some kind of great discovery. It was basically looking at reality as reality is. So I'll give him that. I know he doesn't take responsibility. He refused to take responsibility for the shock therapy. As he put it, it was implemented. It was implemented incorrectly. It kind of, maybe I'm wrong, but it kind of reminds me. If you talk to any diehard communists, they'll tell you every single communist nation in the world, and they've all failed or mutated into something other. They all implemented communism incorrectly. Well, maybe it just can't be implemented correctly the way you think it should be. And same thing with the shock therapy. It's just, there were better ways to do it without the shock, just with the therapy, in a more controlled environment instead of this wild, wild east that created. So yeah, I mean, it was a shot in the head, basically a baseball bat to the cranium in the 90s to Russia.
Yeah, most Americans really don't know who he is. If they know who he is, they're hearing about him no longer on the mainstream media where he was a popular commentator, an economist, but now he's all over the alt media. He's kind of like their golden boy. And what really bothers me, and even RT, when they publish his article, at least one that I saw, they give his credentials. They called him a leading political expert. They mentioned nothing. I can't believe RT didn't mention anything about his history here in the 1990s for 3 years. They don't mention it at all. It's never mentioned in the United States. And when it is mentioned and brought up to Sachs, he whines and says, well, the United States really didn't help support Russia at this time. I mean, I'd forgive this guy if he'd get on his knees, he'd beg forgiveness from the Russian people for what he did in the 1990s that cost the lives of so many. The desperation, the poverty, the lack of paid wages and pensions, the starvation. I mean, people in America cannot understand, and I didn't live through it, but I'm living with people who did live through it. And American people cannot understand that. They just give them a free pass. I don't understand that. I think at least they should tell their followers, whoever they are, who this guy really is, and then let them decide whether or not he's going to be their savior, their golden boy. I don't know. What do you think?
As an Orthodox Christian, we have a faith base that people change. So my hope is that he saw the light and he's changed. And that's why he's taken on the role he has. I don't know. I can't judge because I don't know what's going on in his head. But his record is, as you stated, that's what his record is. It was a disastrous time. It was an absolute disastrous time. No, he's right that the U.S. did absolutely nothing. The U.S. is, in fact, betting on Russia collapsing into small pieces because the U.S. came in with this attitude. U.S. didn't win the Cold War. The U.S. didn't win the Cold War, but the Soviet Union lost the Cold War. It's the same thing as you're playing pool with somebody, and that person sinks the 8-ball. You didn't win, but they lost. You didn't win by your talent. They just screwed up and more than you did and lost. So that's kind of how the first Cold War ended. So the second Cold War seems to have gone from cold to hot pretty damn quick. And partially because there's no adults in the U.S. I mean, there's literally no communications between the Russian government and the U.S. government. Back channel maybe through 4 or 5 layers, and they're unofficial. The Cuban Missile Crisis had direct back channel communications. There is none. And the pettiness, the sophomoric, vapid, intellectually decrepit and dead government of the United States, and again, they make the worst excess of the Cold War look like enlightening the children of the Renaissance. I mean, these people are literally the worst of the human genome. And that's what runs the American and the British government and the German government, the Italians. By the way, I'm a monarchist, and there's a reason I'm a monarchist, because all republics die, and they all die because the scum like that is what comes up to the top. This theory that, oh, if we just have elections, we'll get the best of the best. No, you won't. You never will. It doesn't work that way. It's a popularity contest, and it's a bribing contest. That's all an election is. And you get the people that you get. That's what America is now. In the first couple of elections, you may get really good people because there's this fever of, wow, we got to make this work because we believe in it. It goes away with the next generation. And it just steadily gets worse and worse. And then all republics die within 250 years. So the U.S. is there. And they die because it's a money grab. And nobody holds responsibility. The next group comes in, and their job is to get rich fast and feed their backers. So it is what it is. So I don't see, as far as Sachs goes, get back off topic. I'm sorry, I devolved. Again, I'd like to believe that he saw the error of his ways. I don't think he probably did, but I'd like to believe that. But yeah, from the economical point of view, you really got to look at his record there is crap. Really is crap. And the U.S., of course, it didn't support Russia. It had no intention to support it. It had the intentions of lording over, raping, and pillaging.
Yeah, exactly. And that is the really official stated United States foreign policy, is to weaken Russia, take it down, get rid of Putin. And it's always been the goal of the colonialists, the imperialists, to steal the resources. It's Russia's vast resources and territory they have always lusted for. And I think, in terms of Jeffrey Sachs, I don't give him the benefit of the doubt. Some of my friends said, well, you should forgive, and maybe he's seen the light. I would maybe forgive him if he got on his knees and he apologized publicly to the Russian people for what he did to them, and how he's had like these guys go to jail and they find Jesus. Just come out and tell me that you found Jesus and now you've seen the light. Anyway, enough of Jeffrey Sachs. I feel it very strongly because I'm living here now, and I'm living with people who do remember him. I'm living with people who lived through the 90s. Some of them are in their 80s. Others are in their 50s who were in college during those days. They remember what happened. And the thing that all of them know, it was a plan of the United States government, Bush 1 and Clinton, to break up Russia and steal its resources. And unfortunately for them, and fortunately for Russia and the world, one VV Putin emerged from out of nowhere to rebuild the country to what it is today. Right. Go ahead.
Some people are going to say, Russia is an imperial power because Russia was an imperial power. But the interesting thing is, as much as the U.S. says, the U.S. is the legacy of the Roman Republic or whatever. No, actually, Russia is. And not just the Eastern Roman Empire, but the Western Roman Empire. Because if you look at it, what most Americans don't realize, and actually most Europeans don't realize either, while we Slavs are 83% of the population, the other 19% of the population are over 180 different ethnic groups and races that have all have their homelands within the Russian state. I'm not even counting Germans that migrated to Russia or other ethnic groups that migrated from outside the borders. I'm talking about those people that have been in those borders when the Russian borders moved into those areas. And all those people, nobody was exterminated. This is the American Indians. Nobody was exterminated. If anything, we built cities, universities, and factories, and so on. We stopped slavery in a lot of the Siberian areas for the tribes that used to hunt, sell women from other tribes. We brought education in, And a lot of those people started climbing the social ladders. There was no racial exclusion by race. I mean, if you look at Shoigu, who's a Buddhist, by the way, he's not Slavic. You can't say Russian. Even if you look at the previous patriarch, Alexei II, he was an ethnic German. So there's not, Russia, if anything, really is that melting pot that the U.S. claims to be. There was never any extermination of any minorities. No minorities were enslaved and brought to some plantations. They were incorporated. So if anything, we are what the Roman Empire was, the Roman Republic and then Empire. With all the new territories Rome took, it made them Roman. And the local people stayed there and they became Roman and wanted to become Roman. And then long after, they still consider themselves Roman. So they incorporated, they invested, as opposed to the Western empires, where basically colonial empires, they just dropped a colony, got rid of the locals because they were usually sitting on top of some resources they needed, or they enslaved them, and popped up enough infrastructure just for their own people there and to support extraction economies in those colonies. Basically strip them and drop your excess goods on them. That's it. It's totally different models of how to build a society.
That's really interesting. I have tried to learn as much as I can about Russia and Russian history. You've just articulated something that I think was very important. Anyway, I want to stay on the topic of Russia and the post 1990s, beginning in 2000 with President Putin. Now, I have tried to analyze President Putin by listening to, oh my God, countless number of speeches. The last several of his biannual, this year was only once, press conferences with several hundred journalists from around the world sitting there answering their questions without notes, without an attorney talking into his ear. I wonder what you think about President Putin. And I want to ask you this because it's controversial. Up until last year, Putin attended the World Economic Forum, sponsored by Klaus Schwab, who wants to depopulate the planet, have this great reset. And I wonder how you see, as a Russian-born American citizen and educated in the military, now back in Russia, how do you see Putin? Is Putin one of them? Do you think he's part of the globalist agenda? Or do you think he, and this is what I hope, he's really a patriotic Russian who loves his country, who loves the basic human values that Russia has espoused, and whether he's a devout Orthodox Christian or not, he certainly respects it. What are your thoughts on Vladimir Putin?
Well, I'm also a Russian citizen, so I'll be voting for him in the next elections in 24. You know, I used to tell before all this started, I'm talking about the special military operation, the active war with the West. I used to tell Western colleagues that the biggest criticism of Putin and foreign affairs is that he's too soft on the West. And he was. Because he still believed up to a couple of years ago, basically to 22, 23, to about the end of 21, beginning of 22, he still believed that we could all integrate, and Russia could integrate with the West on an equal term. If you listen to speeches, and they started making a turn in that direction of, well, you don't want to accept us, we'll make you accept us on equal terms, back in 2006. Valdai's speech in 2006. And the West ignored it, and then they tried to get rid of him because when they started getting a little worried about him, but they still never took Russia seriously. They got no choice now. The thing is, though, integrating Russia into the West, that not only that train leave, that boat has sailed, but that train station and that port are burnt. And in fact, there's several generations of Russians that can't stand the West now. That doesn't mean they want to kill all Americans or British or something like that. But Western culture is junk. And they've seen it for what it is. They've seen that unhinged hatred of everything Russian that the West is just oozing. And when you say it's just the elites of the government, it's not. Quite a few of the people are just brainwashed or have always had it in them and are now allowed to really hate someone and still be politically correct. So the West has lost Russia. When all this is over, even if it ends tomorrow, what was before isn't going to happen again. And Russians are looking at the West in a whole different way after all of this. I mean, there's always going to be a liberal Anglophile element, but they're a minority. And they're a minority. Russian culture has gone very conservative over 2 years. There was a party held by the media elites, the various stars, the ones that haven't ran away screaming "We hate Russia," and then went broke somewhere in the West because nobody needs them there. But the ones that stayed, they had a near naked party in one of the clubs where they all came in lingerie and things like that, see-through clothing, and then they posted all over their sites, and you know, it was 1 million rubles a ticket, so it was like $12,000 a ticket. The club's been closed down for at least a month. They've all been coming out making videos of trying to explain how they got in there. Kokorov, I went into the wrong door, so that's why you're in see-through clothes, posing in front of the media, and all this because the backlash has been massive. And the problem is these types of guys, they've been getting away with doing all this crazy LGBT, all this other crap for 30 years, and they can't. They're in shock now how much the Russian culture just not only doesn't want it, but won't stand for it anymore. They're not going to be written off. Yeah, whatever. They're media stars, and okay, they're not jobs, and okay, well, whatever. No, culture has gotten very far conservative. Very far religious, and it's the ones that were working on Russian state television. There are bills being pushed through Parliament to strip them of all of their contracts, and so on. And it just shows how much society in a short time has really changed. The trends that were already heading that way have accelerated on rocket fuel, and they're continuing to accelerate. So the country in the 90s that idealized the West and everything else. I mean, the West really in the 90s could have shaped anything out of Russia. It was warm, soft putty. You could have done anything with it you wanted to. Push it into the EU, push into NATO, do everything. Putin actually asked to join NATO. In fact, Stalin did the same thing back in '48. Because they still believed they could integrate with the West. I knew what it was going on. I'm not trying to pat myself on the back, but I've been telling everybody for 12 years this war was going to come. Because I lived there, I served there, I saw who we trained and we prepped against on a corps level staff. Corps being 4 divisions plus lots of battalions and brigades, individual battalions and brigades. So, and I saw at that point it was the big eye opener, to see who in the late 90s, early 2000s, who were still training for and getting ready to go to war with. It never changed from being Russia. So, the West it didn't even not accept Russia as an equal. The aim was always to destroy Russia. Weaken it, destroy it from internally, with Russia's own hands if possible. But And that realization has now finally come to the forefront. And a lot of things that Putin is now saying he wouldn't say 2 years ago. But they're finally talking the truth. That was maybe not politically correct to say earlier. That political correctness has gone away. Finally, thank God. So, yeah, I think the problem too with Putin's government was, and it's been steadily going in the right direction, was just the amount of American agents, provocateurs, if you want to say, well, not just American, but Western, that were embedded in the government, that were put in place in the 90s. And they pulled in people, like-minded people behind them. You got rid of one guy, still had a bunch of other guys like-minded. And purging them out of positions of power took time. And there's still more than a few of those people left. A lot of them learned to shut the hell up, which may be even worse than if they just openly talk about it. But there's still those types of people. There's not nearly as many. They may be even a minority, full minority now, but they're still there, steadily being weeded out. So it was, I mean, the 90s, basically the U.S. ran the Russian government at all levels. There were American military advisors, CIA, that was sitting in every single Russian military unit, including strategic nuclear weapons. Let's let that sink in. I mean, that's the level of penetration, 110%. Probably 230%, because it wasn't just the U.S., it was the English, it was Germans and others in different areas. The U.S. was just the most widespread. So, yeah. But they easily could have, if they just had accepted, at least held off their Russophobia better in the 90s, things could have gone different. But they didn't, and they won't. And nobody's coming back to that. So the people that are still waiting for the new Yeltsin to show up, he ain't coming, huh? It ain't gonna happen. Never.
You know, I really appreciate what President Putin has been articulating in the last couple of years. Um, Not only is he talking about not a different kind of Russia, appealing to Russian tradition, Russian history, violently opposing the rewriting and whitewashing of history, and not just World War II, all of it. Uh, he has talked about basic family values. I think he's tried to put into practice policies that help families, uh, policies that support families with children. These have been his main talking points. Um, the other thing about President Putin that I think is extraordinary, and I was so happy to see, um, he has been the primary point man for advocating for a new multipolar world. And President Z has bought into this with BRICS, but it's not Z who's the international spokesperson for this, it's Putin. And what is he talking about? He's talking about the respect for all countries, the respect for the sovereignty of all countries, equality of all. He's talking about development. You know, it's like a rising tide raises all ships, all boats. This is what he's talking about, a new paradigm to reorganize the world with a strict observance to international law, not this new, whatever that America calls it, new world law or government, whatever it is.
Rules-based order.
Rules-based order. Rules. And he's talking about the strict observance to the principles of the United Nations. He's the only one in the world talking about this. And I've been saying it now for a short period of time, and I think you'll agree with me. What Putin is doing and what he's saying represents the only hope that the rest of the world has to rid itself of a hegemon, colonialism, and American imperialism? Your closing thoughts.
The West, no, I can't say the West doesn't have any good ideas, but the West, if you look historically, has been first and foremost parasitical. The great British Industrial Revolution started with the rape of India. That's starting capital that Marx talks about. You got to get it somewhere. So, if you rape the next country over and steal everything from them, you get the starting capital a lot faster. And the West has the difference is, at least previously in the West, you had competing powers. So you had some kind of balance. But now, right, you've got one hegemon nation and a bunch of vassal statelets run by an elite created by the West. And it's not even, and not just by the West, and not just by Americans. Schwab is he's not the decision maker. He's one of maybe the first tier below the decision makers. He's only one up. Yeah, he got more famous with the World Economic Forum, but WEF is not the only game in town. And these transnational individuals that are running, they're all basically finances. They're running the Western world. I mean, and they are. They're trying to run the whole world. Now, all these poor countries, basically, all they could do is shrug their shoulders and go, frick, what can we do about it? Now, Russia stood up hard, and the West is broken against Russia's will. And a lot of countries are flocking because they're going, hey, well, if we ally with the Russians, we have a chance of saving ourselves. Georgia, not the state, the republic, the hardcore nationalists in Georgia, the hardest core nationalists in Georgia want Georgia to become part of Russia again. The less hardcore just want Georgia to be under the Russian umbrella. And the logic behind that is the only way Georgians will remain Georgians is if they're either part of or under the Russian umbrella. Because the West is destroying Georgian culture as fast as it can. Big stumbling point was the LGBT pride parades, which the Georgians tore down and drove out. And after that, they're talking down to by EU commissioners, commissars. So all these cultures are going, the only way we stay who we are is if we go to the one guy that's actually defending traditional values. And the West doesn't defend traditional values. It destroys them everywhere. And by the way, America, if we're going to talk, the country that supports republics, America has murdered off more republics than any other country in the world. America, the two types of government America despises most of all is monarchies and republics. Because in both cases, the government starts to think that its resources are for itself and its people. How dare they? The government America likes the most, real government. I'm not talking about the facade, the real government, or what we see in Ukraine, a dictatorship, a petty, cheap dictatorship, where the dictator knows that the only way he survives and steals, a kleptomaniac dictatorship, is if he does what his master in DC or in London, the chapter of DC there, tells him what to do. That's the only way he stays in power. If you look at most of the governments in Europe today, they are those petty kleptomaniac dictatorships.